Welcome to Encounter, where we celebrate putting faith into action and community leaders who live out compassion, grace, and love. We're a program of the Broome County Council of Churches that addresses food insecurity through Chow and the Greater Good Grocery, provides hospital and jail ministry, builds wheelchair ramps, and assists neighbors with transportation and shopping services through Faith in Action volunteers. We invite you to the conversation. Encounter your neighbors as we learn to walk together in love and kindness.
Good morning. Welcome to Encounter. I'm your host today, Joe Sellepack, Executive Director at the Broome County Council of Churches. Churches have festivals. They have celebrations. They have feasts. They have times when the people gather together to talk about the history of their church and also to celebrate maybe their ethnic heritage or any number of other things. But today I found out that there is a congregation inside of our area who is having a really interesting feast or a festival of sorts to commemorate a very interesting time of the church's life. To help me talk through this is Scott Parnell. He's the priest at Christ Episcopal Church where this feast or this meal is going to take place. Welcome to Encounter, Scott.
Thank you so much, Joe.
So let's just start off with that. What is this thing that we're talking about?
Absolutely. So 1,700 years ago, a group of folks got together in a place called Nicaea, which is in modern day Turkey, and they had a conversation. It was a pretty significant conversation in the life of the church, momentous in what it is. A number of sort of the denominational traditions appeal to the Nicene Creed. And so, this is what we're celebrating, 1,700 years of Nicaea.
Nicaea.
Yes.
So why were they gathered in Nicaea at that time?
Well, it's probably worth backing up just a little bit before that. So the church and the Roman Empire did not always get along well. Right. In fact, there were periods of intense persecution, and one of those began roughly in the year 304. So the principal emperor at the time, his name was Diocletian.
Yeah.
And that Diocletian realized that the empire was fairly unruly because of how large it was. And so he actually sort of split it into two. And that you had a senior emperor and a junior emperor, that they would sort of bump up and succeed one another and things like that. Well, his sort of co-emperor was Galerius. And Galerius really didn't like the Christians.
Oh, right. Yeah.
But ultimately this gets tacked on Diocletian because Diocletian was the one that made the choice.
Right.
And that previously Diocletian was pretty ambivalent. He didn't really care. But in 304, the empire started issuing these statements that caused what is known as the Great Persecution. That you were not allowed to, if you were a Christian, you couldn't hold public office. You couldn't sort of do anything publicly. Eventually it got to the point where you couldn't own land, where the empire would come in and they would sort of take over church property. It would get to the point where ultimately clergy and then even lay persons were required to sacrifice to the emperor, and if they didn't, let's just say they would be sacrificed.
And then they couldn't also participate within the economic
Yep. Right. So it was a fairly strong disadvantaged period.
Right. Exactly.
So this went on for a number of years. And ultimately, Galerius sort of realized that this was not working out, and that it wasn't stopping the problem. And that he did issue, it was called the Edict of Tolerance. I believe it was in the year 308. He sort of came back and said, do whatever you're going to do. Just pray for the empire, and we'll hope it all gets sorted out in the end.
Right.
And so that was sort of that. And then we have this big moment with Constantine, right? The Battle of Mulvian Bridge, the conversion. Constantine sort of becomes emperor over all of it. And in this, he issues the Edict of Milan.
Yeah.
Which is sort of this point that we look at where Christianity becomes an officially acceptable religion within the Roman Empire.
Now, some have argued that the Edict of Milan was not only about it was the first step toward making Christianity the
Absolutely.
But at the time when it was done, it was actually one of many accepted religions.
It was one of many accepted religions, and that it sort of undid a lot of what was done during the Great Persecution. Right. But it wouldn't be until 381 when Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica that sort of made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And even, between Constantine and Theodosius, it would swing back and forth, that as we'll talk about with the Arian controversy. One of Constantine's sons was an Arian. Later we would have Julian, that was affectionately named the Apostate, that tried to revert back to the Roman pantheon. But then sort of Theodosius would sort of transform Rome into this Holy Roman Empire before Charlemagne came up with the name.
Now, one of the things that I think is interesting is this conversion of Constantine.
Yeah.
So, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I believe there are like four accounts of how this happened. 3 of the 4 are very religious. The 4th one is what we would consider fairly secular in it. But at the end of the day, something happened. Right? Emperors don't wake up all of a sudden and decide, we're just going to shift gears. And
I was told that his mother was a Christian. Is that correct?
Helena. Yeah.
Helena, right.
And so, so the story goes that here's this battle that is getting ready to take place, the Battle of Mulvian Bridge, and that Constantine had a dream of sorts where he saw something, and that the traditional sort of recounting of the story is that he saw a cross, and that the voice from heaven that said, "In this sign you will conquer," and that Constantine paints crosses on all of the shields and stitches them into their uniforms and miraculously wins the battle, and that sort of sealed his fate as a Christian. And there's all sorts of lore that goes along with it. How much of it is true? How much is pious legends?
So what is the secular story then?
I can't remember. It's been 20 years since I've read it.
Well, and what's interesting is that there was a professor from Michigan, University of Michigan, who came to Binghamton University just a few years ago to talk about the conversion of Constantine. And he basically just did the pious version of it. And I asked him the question. I think it's a valid question still. Are there other reasons that an emperor would convert? Yeah. And what would those reasons might those reasons be? Especially if you're an emperor of a very very complex thing like the Roman Empire. What is it about Christianity that would lead itself toward being that universally understood religion?
Yeah, I could see that, but I professionally work in organizations that trade in belief, and not tipping the hat too far into Nicaea. Christians can't even agree on a date of Easter, right? And so to claim a religious shift is a fairly substantial thing, right? Again, right now, the East and West, we can't agree what day we should celebrate this day.
Easter, right?
Yeah, and it's just a day.
Yeah.
But so to begin shifting an entire religious system within an empire, that would be the equivalent of someone trying to do that in the United States today.
Right.
And we're very keenly aware of how folks probably really wouldn't like that.
Right.
And that would blow a huge amount of political capital on something that if you really didn't believe it, probably wouldn't be worth it.
Okay.
I that's maybe my practical experience of, to shift a day of Easter causes this huge headache. Why shift an entire belief system?
And yet Constantine is very, very much involved in the Council of Nicaea.
He is. And I think part of it was that he recognized that there was this sort of broad swath of what was being practiced in Christianity. And I think today we sort of live under a myth where there was one way that it was done, right? So you hear this appeal, the early church, right? What did the early church do? And that this is, how did they pray? For some traditions, right? How was the Eucharist celebrated? What were the words that Jesus and the apostles said? And that's a myth that we know from a fairly high-level academic standard, that there were different sort of municipal centers around the empire that had their own way of doing it. Right, and that from the Roman Rite, based in Rome, you had the Eastern rites, you had the North African rites, my own tradition, the Episcopal Anglican Church of England tradition. We preserved the Sarum Rite, which was what was done in Salisbury, England, from the 900s. If you look at that 900 liturgy and what we do today, we've moved two prayers around, and like that we preserve this way of having done it. And so that across the empire, there were all sorts of different ways of expressing this understanding of Jesus, and that what became important was, well, who was Jesus? That this faith in this being, if you will, not to sort of make a label on it right now, right, that it was the thing that sustained the church through those persecutions. This understanding of who Jesus was, what Jesus's vision of the world was, that was the thing that motivated them.
Right.
And so to figure out, so how are we going to define this? And depending on where you're coming at it, there are a lot of reasons of why you might want to have that conversation. Part of it was, trying to understand the Gospels talk about the Father and the Son. Well, what's the relationship between those two things, right? Why are we using those words, and what do those words mean in terms of the understanding of Jesus that we have? There were essentially two camps that were there, and this is simplifying it because there was sort of a third one off to the side. But that you had sort of what would become Nicene Orthodoxy, which is the position that the church takes today, where that the Father and the Son are eternally coexistent with one another. And then you had another position that's known as the Arian position, that was where...
What's the theological word for that?
Homoousia.
Ousia, yeah.
Right? And that, so then you have the Arian position. So Arius was from Egypt, that he propagated an understanding where the Son was created, not begotten.
Right.
Sort of his protest rally board would say there was a time when he was not. That was sort of his claim. And that sort of the church said, well, there's some real challenges if that's the case. Because if that's the case, that the experience of the Son in Jesus in this earthly life then misses divinity.
Right.
And that this call to divinity, in some ways, it had a lot to do with how does God resonate with human suffering. Right. We can look at the world and see the injustice that is there. Right. That how does God relate to that? And so one of the appeals of
it's not only that divinity, that Christ is divine, but also that Christ is equally human.
Yes.
That allows for that conversation to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And so that gets teased out almost 120 years later at the Council of Chalcedon.
Right.
But right now, they're just trying to figure out how did it come to be? And so when you have this sort of understanding, and then Athanasius, for instance, is sort of the pro-Nicene side, will come back and say, no, right, that God became humans so that humans might be assumed into God's divinity. And that sort of his seminal work was on the Incarnation. And that he also was an African priest, presbyter, bishop that would become sort of fairly influential in this. The Council of Nicaea itself, right? There are a couple other historical figures that we know and love.
Saint Nicholas.
Saint Nicholas
Yes.
being the principal one there, and that it is actually reported that Nicholas got into a fist fight at Nicaea.
He did.
Over this, and that we've actually done like scans on the remains of Nicholas, which is in Bari, Italy, and it turns out that he's had his nose broken 3 or 4 times, and that was who he
probably
was.
one of them.
Yeah, probably one of them.
So my guest today is Scott Parnell, and we've been talking about a festival or a feast or a meal, a banquet that his church is going to be having on a date, September 24th.
September 27th, so
27th.
Saturday, September 27th at 4 p.m. Bishop Bill Franklin, who is the current assisting bishop in the Diocese of Long Island and the former 11th bishop of the Diocese of Western North Carolina. Bishop Franklin has a PhD in church history from Harvard. He is coming to sort of talk about the unity of Nicaea and why that is a significant thing for the church today, and the various traditions and denominations that are in Binghamton and throughout the world. That we're inviting this as an ecumenical celebration of 1,700 years of unity. That I know that we have our disagreements about a lot of stuff, but one of the things that we don't disagree on is the creed, this sort of foundational thing.
And so if a person wanted to get tickets or wanted to attend, how would they do that?
So they can go to the Christchurch website, christchurchbinghamton.org, and you can click for Nicaea, or you can do simply /Nicaea. That if we have it on the screen, you can also scan the QR code there. That'll take you directly to where the tickets are linked. Tickets for this are free. We're doing tickets so that we know how many folks that we're expecting. We also have the opportunity after the lecture that if folks would like to stay for an authentic Turkish meal, we're going to have a panel discussion. Father Jim Dutko is going to be on the panel, as well as Dr. Gary Hansen, who also has a PhD in church history. We'll be discussing the legacy of Nicaea. And that if Saturday folks aren't available for, Bishop Franklin will be celebrating and preaching at our Eucharist service on Sunday morning at 10 a.m.
And so the emerging from this really conflict-laden, as you suggested, Nicholas and the rest of them, they get into this conflict-laden situation. But emerging from this is this creed that everyone can relate to, because most congregations have said the Nicene Creed at some point. How did that come about?
So, I mean, I think that there was a general consensus that as the sides were presented, the word, so when we talk about the creed, in it we say that we believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. And that phrase, on one being, I know our Roman Catholic siblings shifted the translation consubstantial with the Father a few years ago. But that word in Greek is homoousia.
Homoousia.
And that is sort of this understanding that it is of the same substance,
right.
Of the same substance of the Father. Arius's position became known as homoousia. And you can hear the difference, homoousia, homoousia. And we would look at the letters and we would say, oh, that's an I. But in Greek, that's an iota.
Right.
And it's actually, this is where we get the phrase, it doesn't make an iota's difference. This is the iota that made a huge difference within the church.
Right.
And that it comes from this understanding that was Jesus eternally God, or was Jesus created? Mm-hmm. And that, that the Christian position is that Christ was eternally begotten, was eternally of the same substance of the Father.
So the other question that kind of emerges from this is the humanity of Jesus eternal?
Absolutely.
And in what way does that influence God?
I would venture to say that a lot of times Christianity, right, we focus on Good Friday and Easter.
Right.
And a lot of times we skip the Ascension,
Right.
which comes 40 days later.
Right.
And that the Ascension is that image of the union of the divinity and the humanity. That it is a restoration, if you will, of Eden,
Right.
where the man and the woman created in the image and likeness of God, given responsibility of God for the stewardship of the earth. The Apostle Paul writes about this in Romans, where he talks about Christ as the new Adam, that there's this sort of this new creation that takes place. I think one of the metaphors that gets used is the transformation of a caterpillar into a butterfly. Right, that they are the same and they are different. And that is sort of this glorified humanity. Last month in August, the church celebrated the Feast of the Transfiguration, where we get a little glimpse of what that looks like, where we see a future, God's future imagined for us on display, in sort of Jesus' transfiguration. But then again, itself in the resurrection, the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, it discloses a little bit about the finality of God.
And when you were speaking about the problem of evil, I'd like to revisit that now.
Yeah.
Because it seems to me as if the issue of evil and theodicy is part of the issue that's at play within this. So how does one reconcile evil or the presence of suffering, especially?
Yeah, so I think the historical sort of class category this falls under is known as patropassionism, right? The suffering of the Father,
right?
And that at some level, right, that this is we're walking through dangerous theological waters here, partially because
everybody interprets it differently.
Well, it interprets it differently, but we also don't use the same theological, philosophical framework that would have been used in the 4th century. Right, that a lot of folks, for instance, don't really hold a Neoplatonic understanding. We don't see Aristotelian distinctions in the way that it once was, but the way that it once was, that was the lens and language that it got reasoned out through. And so it's like we're translating across metaphysical frameworks where we're trying to sort of say, how do we preserve these things while acknowledge these things, using a framework that we just don't wear anymore. I don't know, I have astigmatism, but I also have a pair of glasses that aren't corrected for the astigmatism. And so when I put them on, my eyes hurt,
right?
Even though I can see. As opposed to if I take them off, I'm blind as can be. Right? But so it's kind of like translating across not only time and language, but philosophical system. Our eyes hurt with it a little bit.
Right.
And you start, from a pure theological lens, you start committing heresy left, right, and center. But if I were to try and articulate it in a contemporary sort of understanding, is that we're curious about how does the experience of human Jesus, right, the agony, right, that we see this, the angst, the pain, right, the experience of suffering, how does that get translated and assumed into something that by definition does not change?
Right.
And those are kind of two contradictory things that this begins to try and hold together.
And it would seem like empathy would be a part of that.
Yeah. And I think
that God feels with us.
Yes, right. But the problem with feeling is that produces change,
right? Which
violates a sort of Platonic understanding that God is immutable.
And I don't think it's what's interesting is that part of and I'm just put my hand out there. Part of my theological training has been under people who actually question the immutability of God.
Yeah. Process theology, right?
Right.
So believe it or not, my background is actually in organic chemistry,
Yeah.
which part of that is the study of physical chemistry, which is where, Alfred North Whitehead was a physical chemist. And that some of his writing into process theology is based in quantum mechanics. And that, Schrodinger's dilemma of what happens that starts manifesting, no pun intended, in the process theology.
I think we were going to have another show on this at some point in time, because it would be a really fascinating conversation. But right now we're talking about something that's happening at your congregation on September 27th. You want to just reiterate for folks what that is?
We're inviting the people of Binghamton to come and to celebrate 1,700 years of Nicaea, 1,700 years of unity in doctrine and belief in the church. That we know that things have different denominations interpret things differently, practice things differently, and this is one thing that historically we have all agreed to. And so despite our division and disunity, it is worth on this 1700th anniversary to celebrate what does bind us together. And so Bishop Bill Franklin, who's a PhD in church history from Harvard, will be coming to present the unity of Nicaea at Christ Church on Saturday, September 27th at 4 p.m. And that tickets are available online. They're free. We're just asking sort of with a head count. And then if folks are interested, we also have a ticketed dinner at beginning at 5:30 p.m. At the church that you can also register for. That will be an authentic Turkish meal, but it will also include a panel discussion on Nicaea and how different traditions engage with that.
And has he written, Bishop Franklin, has he written a book on Nicaea?
He's not specifically written on Nicaea. He has done work in the early church, but not specifically on Nicaea. That this is something that we, honestly, Bishop Franklin and I are on a national board together, and as I've gotten to know him and talk with him, the insight and wisdom that he brings is just really important. And so we invite folks to this.
So in our last minute, what are the takeaways from Nicaea that we can that would help the congregations currently within Binghamton?
I think within Binghamton, it is to remember our unity, right? Our unity is in the emulation of Christ that the Nicene Council determined was fully God, eternally begotten of the Father. And if that is true, then what Jesus does out and in the world is a reflection of God itself. And the church, as the body of Christ, is called to continue that work. And so we must remain faithful to those whom Jesus was faithful. We must advocate for those that are poor and oppressed, for the widow, for the orphan. We must work for the common good of all people. And we must do it together.
So my guest today has been Scott Parnell. Welcome. Thank you for being on Encounter. Thank you for talking about this important festival that you are going to be celebrating at your church. And for all of you today, I pray that you would be good and kind to each other, and maybe take a little of the discussion about Nicaea to heart, and learn to be kind and considerate to even those people who Jesus himself loves. Have a great day.